Let's roll. This is Countercharge, your podcast for ranks, flanks, and kings of war. Join your hosts as they delve into the world of Panithor and bring you worldwide coverage of all things Kings of War.
Welcome to Countercharge. This is Marcelo, the most international Kings of War player.
And I'm Rob Fnuff, and we are back again for another List Builder Studio, this time with Marcelo. We're super excited because you are infamous in some circles.
You can blame Jeff Trash for making me move from Brother Mark to Green Lady.
You obviously have an interesting story. You've got a long, rich history that spans multiple countries and multiple decades. Give us a sense of your origin story into wargaming and the ebbs and flows that led you to Kings of War.
Sure. So I'm born in Argentina. I've lived most of my time in Australia, which is where I started gaming. And many people that play Kings of War, I started in Warhammer Fantasy. I was an avid Warhammer Fantasy player. A lot of tournament scenes. I ran big events. I ran the pilgrimage here now, but the first time I ran the pilgrimage was in 2008 in Australia. I started a gaming club called the Battle Pilgrims in Australia. People that are playing Kings of War today, some of them are still, Battle Pilgrims from those fantasy days, like Jeff Trash in Australia. And many others, when Warhammer Fantasy blew up, we went into other games, and I played many other games. Even today, I play Firefight, 40K, The Old World. I could keep going. I'm an avid gamer, but I have to say that Kings of War is my favorite game. Like, if I have a choice of playing another gaming system or Kings of War, I will take Kings of War. But as I like to get any kind of game in, when there's no Kings of War players, I play something else. I didn't come into Kings of War until I actually relocated and moved to the US about 11 years ago. And I very busy when I came over because I expanded a company that I had in Australia into the US. But about 4 years ago, was when I started looking into Kings of War, getting back into that fantasy ranks and flanks genre. And the year that I started playing was when we had the Masters at Texas. What year was that, Rob?
2021.
Yes, and that was like I started playing 6 months before that. And I think it was a COVID year. Yes, it must have been, because there weren't enough events. And I just went because it was kind of like a ticket draw.
Yeah, it was the first time I ever met you, too, because you had that beautiful Brotherhood army.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct. Good memory. So those are really my Bretonians from my Warhammer Fantasy days. All right. So, and I still use them as part of the Green Lady, but, I've expanded the army, and now there's a lot more to it. So, Kings of War is my preferred game.
It's interesting because, as you said, Australia, back to Warhammer and podcasting, Australia was the capital of that, right? So Jeff Carroll and the Podhammer podcast, which covered Warhammer. And I'm sure there's some of those players that are now in the Kings of War community, but you guys had a crazy scene.
Yeah, we did.
Very, very intense and crazy scene.
We did, and we were really into it. It's harder to travel from Australia to anywhere else because it's the opposite end of the world from the US and very far away from Europe. But the highlight was towards the end of 8th edition when the Australian team went to the European Team Championships. And we competed there. It was very big in the Warhammer Fantasy days. And we came fourth as a country. I won every single one of my games. Tracy did pretty well as well. It was teams of 8 back then, I think it was. So, and that was fun. And I love to see another world type championship in for Kings of War. I don't know why it hasn't happened.
I think it's ripe to put something in Philly.
Don't tempt me. I just might.
So you're playing in the Mid-Atlantic. Give me a little sense of what the tournament scene is like in the Mid-Atlantic.
We're very fortunate in the Mid-Atlantic to have a lot of amazing TOs. We have people that have been running tournaments for many, many years. We have a very strong scene. Like the challenge that we have here is when somebody wants to run a new event is when do we fit it in? Like, how do we not step on each other's toes? I've been running the pilgrimage for a few years, and that used to be beginning of March. But now when I go to Adepticon and Clash of Kings, so I now moved it to when, we're still tossing up, okay, is it August? Is it trying to fit it in? So we're fortunate that we have a strong group of TOs, all very supportive of each other. When one event has, grows and has more people, then we have tables and terrains force. The other TOs come to the event with theirs. So the way we, pulled off the Masters this year was by having a lot of great TOs just bringing all their separate, tables, terrain, and it made it very easy to collaborate. We got people like Mike Atkins who, do Dash 28, and it's a really good scene.
Do you play any armies that do not have knights?
I play Lizardmen, and I have dabbled with elves.
Too cool to play elves, though. Let's be honest. You're too cool to play elves.
Yeah, I've really tried to make salamanders work, and I haven't been able to really win events with them. With knights I can win events, but with salamanders I cannot. But I still come from that. I got into the game because of the background of the stories of the armies. And, I always wanted those chivalrous knights. That's why I started with my Bretonnians. And when I came to Kings of War, I was looking for that. And that's how I landed in Brothermark. I had no idea what it was like as an army. Brothermark is probably one of the weaker armies, but it was just that whole story that I loved.
The Brotherhood and then the Brothermark and the forces of the, the Order of the Green Lady, like, that's probably one of the more evocative, organic evolutions, right, of all the armies that are in Kings of War. Just because we started off with, you could argue, this is sort of a Bretonian proxy, and then they sort of made it its own over time. So, I'm excited to see, where we go from here.
Yes.
Well, are you ready to get into the List Builder Studio?
Sure, let's do it.
The List Builder Studio.
All right, well, we're going to start with some general list building principles. And you're someone that I know does use painting services. Does models and aesthetics draw you to an army?
It's more about the story of the background for me. It's like for example, I have never played an evil army. Okay, I have to be with the good guys or with neutral. Like I play Rhodia, I play Kingdoms of Men, but I will never play an evil army. So I have to really get into the story and the background. And, the Brothermark, the Green Lady do that for me.
Does it ever enter in when you're selecting an army, like how the army is going to play, or if there's like a perceived weakness or an advantage of the army? Is that playing into the decision?
No, I wouldn't have started with Brothermark if I was really focused on the effectiveness of the army. I would have probably started with Green Lady from the beginning instead of trying to make Brothermark work. So for me, it's really about the story and the background, and then I'll make it work. I do like speed. I feel that the game is won in the movement phase. So, hence why I like knights, and even better if they fly. But I like having elements of speed, having elements that allow me to position my units in a way that's going to be advantageous.
So when you're building your list, are there any foundational concepts that you use every single time?
Yeah, so there's been an evolution of that. So a lot of my armies were very hammer and anvil. So you're thinking, when I was playing Brothermark, I had big hordes of infantries that were, backed by healing units and with rallying if possible. And thinking of that, and then have those fast elements that can come around the flanks when people come into your ambles. So I think that hammer and anvil concept is good for people that are starting in the game, that can give you multiple different elements, combine arms, and teach you how different types of units work. What's the best that infantry does, and what's the best that cavalry does, and what are the different elements, and how do they work? What's the difference between nimble cavalry and regular cavalry? And now that I've gone beyond the hammer and anvil, it's more about how can I dictate the game, right? What units do I need so that I can punch and eliminate units that I want to take off the table while still holding the rest of the enemy army at bay, so that I can choose my fights with reducing the chances of a counterpunch. So what units so that's a concept, and then what units do I need to do that?
You are more of an aggressive player in terms of play style, but I would also say you're probably more proactive, right? You're trying to get out there and dictate the pace and the decision-making, and you're asking your opponents, hey, here's a question for you to answer. And if you don't answer it correctly, I'm going to wipe you off the board.
Yeah, and I prefer to build all-comers lists. So I don't worry about the meta. I'm not worried about what... I really want to be able to put an army on the table that really doesn't bother me what I play against, where I really am not worried what I'm going to be facing: a shooting army, a defense 6 army, another alpha strike army. I want to go in with all the tools so that I'm not concerned about what's on the other side.
Do you use Universal Battle? And if so, do you use that to develop lists?
Not at all. I only play in person. I love the models. I love the social aspect of it. And I'd rather go and prepare another list and prepare the models for another fight, or go and play another game if I can't have somebody to play Kings of War, than play online. I really prefer the social interaction.
You really do play a lot of combined arms list, even though you do have a lot of speed, heavy hitting elements. There are other support units in those lists. I'm also curious, though, when you look at the flexibility of the list, do you have units that play multiple roles, or do most units in your list, they have one function?
You need to know what the job is of every unit. And when I look at something like my Green Lady list, every unit has a role. They don't tend to play multiple roles unless that's, you're on the later part of the game. And, do I want my flying cavalry to pick up a token? No, I don't. But if they have to, they will. Right? So, I have infantry regiments for that. I have, if there's a Pega Life for that, that's what you want to use them for. But I would say that I fail somewhere else if I need to use the unit for a second role. But it's there in case it's needed. So I primarily view the units as having as primary role in a job that they have to get done.
When you're building your list, or when you're deploying it, or you're playing the army, are you thinking about battle groups, like specific sets of units that work together in tandem?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. So I like having a central battle group that can either go left or right flank. And I like having 2 battle groups, 1 on each flank. It's a question of how strong and how weak each of those flanks are. And I want my center to be able to go and support those flanks when my opponent is not expecting it, or when I feel that it's needed. I have primarily a cavalry type army. So it's not like I'm waiting for the opponent to come to me. It's like I'm looking at the battle and thinking, where am I going to apply pressure? Where can I break through? So my battle groups tend to be center with a couple of cavalry units and some infantry and some faster elements like flyers on the flanks.
Yeah, let's dig into speed and flyers in particular, because you're a big fan of those things. Do you always have flyers in your list? I mean, is that something that's a conscious thing? And, I guess the other question is, do you like to have multiple threat ranges, like different speeds? And then also talk to me about how you are countering your opponent's flyers.
Sure. So, because I believe that the game is won in the movement phase, then speed allows you to position your units where you want them to be. Allow you to have 2/3 of your army facing and punching 1/3 of the opponent's army. And allow you to then get back into the game onto the other side after you've applied pressure, and were able to outnumber your opponent on a section of the board. So in terms of speed, to me, the fastest speed is always the best speed if you can get it. But you got to balance that with, the damage value if it's an alpha strike. So one of the things that I've been, playing with in terms of my Green Lady list is I started with 3 units of Forsaken, the flying cavalry, and 2 units of Redemption, the horse cavalry, with shorter distance. But then I found that I didn't really need that many units that hit, hammers that needed speed. So I ended up dropping one of my flyers, and now I've reversed it. So now it's 3 Redemptions. We punch more than the Forsaken, right? And then 2 Forsaken, because if I have one on each flank, supported by something else, then the opponent needs to be very careful that they're not surrounded. And when I've lost games, like when I think back to my game against Ed Fisk at Masters, and the game that I lost, he played it brilliantly. The game that I lost was because instead of doing what I normally do, of surrounding it and putting forces in 2 flanks, I ended up putting nothing on one flank, and I stacked only one of my flanks. And that meant that it actually allowed him to pivot, to face me, so that we were both front on diagonally across the table. So I learned from that mistake, and now I always make sure I can surround my opponent by having fast units on both flanks.
Talk to me about chaff. How do you consider chaff as you're building your list and you're worried about your opponent's chaff? How's chaff play into this?
So, because I play an alpha strike list, it's about punching hard and not getting stuck, and not suffering the counter punch from the opponent. So 5 hammers is good, but what really makes the 5 hammers good is the fact that I've got the chaff to stop my opponent from counter punching my hammers when I take down their units. And the chaff are just as, if not more important than the hammers. Because without that chaff, those hammers will be counter punched and taken off the table. 1517 doesn't stick around for long. 1517 is not a reliable anvil. So, and, that's a pretty, Defense 5, 1517 is a pretty normal hammer unit in Kings of War. So it means that it's critical to keep my chaff with my cavalry so that I can all go in at the same time. So that I can, go in with the hammers where I want to take units down, and then at the same time go in with the chaff to hold up things that are all around it, so that I can punch, turn, and when my chaff dies, I can go in again.
Some of your armies are kind of on the elite side, right? Like some of the units are more expensive, but I'm curious, like unit strength. If you are such an alpha strike aggressive army, what consideration do you play into unit strength?
So this is still an objective-based game. So it means that unit strength is important. So I like to have something around mid-20s. Like even with my elite-ish type armies, I still have like 23 to 27 unit strength. So I still would not want to go below 23. And my current list of Green Lady is 25. And it's not just about unit strength. It's also about scoring units, right? That's one of the things that Brother Mark suffered from, and the reasons why I had to move on from Brother Mark is that a lot of the inspiring, and you're actually relying on individuals, and you end up with 10 scoring units, and that's just not enough. While with my current list, I can have, 13 drops, which is what most of my armies end up with. Like I normally end up with 13 to 14 drops. That's something that I feel good with on 2,300 points. I wouldn't want to go below 13. Whenever I have gone below 13, there was always units that I needed to finish a job. And the less individuals you have in those 13 drops, the better.
And when you're thinking about number of drops, unit strength, durability plays a role there, right? Like defense, rally, the nerve values, regen. So how does that impact? If you've got more durable units, maybe you need less unit strength. If you have, I don't know, does durability play into that thought process at all?
Every army has its strengths and weaknesses whenever you're looking at what they can offer. You can have things that punch hard but have low defense, or most of the hammers in the human armies have that middle point where 15-17 defense 5 is not, it's not defense 6, it's not 16-18, it's not, but it's okay. It's hard enough that you can grind if you don't allow yourself to be double charged. While the chaff doesn't really matter. Sometimes you actually want chaff to die, because if chaff that gets on the way sometimes can actually stop your units from charging and doing what you want to do. So I'm looking for chaff that's not too strong, that's kind of medium, so that I can go in with the hammers, turn around, let my chaffs die, and then hit again.
That's interesting, Marcelo, because what you're basically saying is, the role for the unit will prescribe the type of durability you're looking for, right? So if you have chaff, you want them to die, whether you don't want them to be durable. But your hammers, if they can play an almost quasi anvil role, that's great, because you don't want them to die. So yeah, that's interesting. Another question that's come up, we've asked this before, but your army, I think, is one that probably could really play with this. But talk to me about height, because your army has various heights. And do you consciously think about that in terms of checkerboarding and stacking, units behind units and being able to have multi-charges?
Yes, and behind terrain. So, I'm used to playing cavalry, so that tends to be height 3. But one of the fun things with Green Lady is that you got the options for the height 4 as well. In your chaff, like Pegasus units, in your Forsaken, the flying cavalry, in some of your supporting heroes that can also fly. And that's got pluses and minuses, right? Because the other side is going to try to shoot down your chaff, and it's going to try and maybe take off a unit of Knights of the Table if they can before you have your first turn or second turn. And height 4 means you can get shot at behind a hill, and you got less places to hide. So what I really care about in terms of height is I got to keep my pigs, the chaff that's weak by design, behind things I can cover it. Because when I put my chaff behind a regular cavalry unit that's height 3, when my chaff is height 4, it's easy, for it to get lightning bolt or, some spell that can either waver it or take it off the table. So you got to be very conscious of the height and see how it interacts with terrain. I don't want my cavalry behind a hill unless the hill is more on my side so that I can get on it and then use it to thunder down the hill. But if I got a hill in the center, I don't want my cavalry that's high 3 because I don't want to get on that hill so that somebody can charge me on the other side, right? So height 4 becomes very handy. So it's good for an army to have different heights so that you can play to its strengths and weaknesses.
And when you're coming at the game from an alpha strike or an aggressive mindset, does that go into spellcasting as well, that you're using mostly offensive spells? Or is this an area that maybe you are looking to wound mitigation or healing?
My preferred playstyle is always to have combined arms, to have a little bit of shooting, a little bit of magic. We primarily, movement, which is where I believe the game is won, and something that can punch hard. And after many games, I'm finding that shooting is not doing that much for me. I can deal with opponents' chaff with my chaff. I can deal with opponents' chaff by letting them chaff me. I often put my hammers within range of their chaff, but out of range of their punchy units. So that if they want to try to chaff me, they can, and it gives me a turn to be able to get rid of that chaff before they can get into range of punching them back. So I find that I can deal with the opponent's chaff between my chaff and the way that I position my hammers to let them chaff me. And that's meant that I don't need shooting as much. I've played with having wizards running around with Bane Chen and giving extra punch. But then if you're positioning things properly and you are in their flank or rears, you don't need Bane Chen. So I ended up getting rid of those wizards as well. And now my only spell is just healing. And I just got the Green Lady with healing, and I find that I don't need the shooting and I don't need any other spells.
Let's talk about inspiring. A lot of people say they need X amount of sources of inspiring per 500 points or whatever. But like when you're thinking about inspiring, how does that work into your list building process?
I think every unit needs to be covered by inspiring. So unless it's a unit that's not in combat, any unit that could be shot at or combat. So I like to have a minimum of 3 inspiring units, inspiring models, so that, and I say units because I'm lucky that in Green Lady, the Redemption Knights are units that inspire. So which is very unusual in the game. But I like to have a minimum of 3. And in my current list, I have like 5.
Let's talk magical artifacts. I'm assuming, because you have a fair amount of hammers, those hammers have magical artifacts to make them even better hammers. When you're building a list, are magical artifacts come when you add the units to the list? Are they the last things you add? Just give us a sense. Are you a heavy or a light user for magical artifacts?
So I think it depends very much on the type of army or list that you're building. So, Jeff and I, who's, Australian Jeff Trash, who's also a battle pilgrim, and runs the club on that side of the world. We're having these arguments all the time in that he says, don't buy anything, just get more units. And I'm thinking, but I need my hammers to strike. Like when my hammers go in, I can't afford to have them stuck. I need to be able, because I'm only expecting my chaff to take 1 hit and die. So I don't have durable chaff. So that means that I need to give the units everything they need in order to punch, delete what they are attacking, and be able to pivot and get ready for when the chaff dies. So I load up on a lot of items on all my hammers.
When you're looking at your units that you're going to put in your list, do you have a preference to go hordes or regiments? I mean, do you ever play troops? Give me a sense of unit size and its implications to your list building process.
Sure. So this is still very much an objective-based game. That means that you still need units that are going to carry tokens, that are going to hold sections of the board, that are going to sit on objectives. So I like to have a combination. So I do like regiments of infantry to add unit strength, to go and sit on a part of the board, to go and sit on an objective. I like having the faster elements. I like having a combined arms type group that can different units that can do different jobs. So I think every unit type has a job. When I was doing the more hammer and anvil, then you needed the hordes. But because I'm not doing hammer and anvil anymore, then regiments are good for me for the job that I've given them.
Let's talk deployment, because you mentioned speed's super important, but also deployment is important. But I guess speed can kind of fix some of your errors if you misdeploy. But in terms of deployment, are you coming to the game with like a scheme of how you will deploy the army? Is it a conscious thing that you're practicing? Okay. Does it affect your list building at all?
When I'm building the list, I'm thinking what's going to go in my center, what's going to go on the strong flank, what's going to go on the weak flank. So at least it is something that I think about during the list so that I can have units that are going to play those different roles. What chaff am I going to dedicate to each of those 3 sections? What kind of support am I going to have in each of those 3 sections? How am I going to keep each of those 3 sections inspired? How I'm going to keep them, even in my weak flank, how am I going to keep them threatening enough so that the opponent doesn't just rush across the board in my weak flank that I just trying to hold up. I'm not really wanting to engage. So, like I mentioned previously, I do like having, you always start with the units that are going to give less away of what your plan is. So, my 3 Pegasus are at the chaff, the Green Lady goes in the center. So, the units that are less impactful or the opponent will be less scared of go down first. And then I tend to, decide which one's going to be my strong flank, my weak flank, and position my center units in a way that they can actually go off to a flank and support a flank when they need to. You don't need much. When you got speed and you have threat range, you don't need a lot of units to hold back the enemy, to hold back those units from just getting across the table.
Let's talk terrain. Terrain's a big part of our game. Some people would say, you need to be fast enough to get through the terrain or fast enough to go around it or smart enough to use it as a defensive advantage. But, how are you thinking about terrain and how your army is going to play in that terrain or use that terrain to your advantage while you're list building?
So I think every army needs some kind of terrain mitigation. If you're lucky that you have armies that have Pathfinder or Strider, that's great. Most of the armies that I'm used to playing, the hammers, which are the most impactful, have never had that mitigation, which means I have to buy it in items that I do need. Boots of striding, that I do need, elements that are going to allow me to mitigate terrain. But again, my thought is that if you can hit somebody in the flank, then even if you go into terrain, that in itself mitigates terrain. Using those heals so that it gives your 4 units cover at least. Putting your chaff units that you don't want shot off the table behind terrain so that they're not going to be visible until you need them to come out. And do you have items in units that can mitigate terrain? Like, you have something that's going to, like Brew of Sharpness, that even though you might hit terrain, at least the unit's going to hit on what it normally does. So, and that kind of decides what units go where.
Do you like to deploy terrain as part of the game? I know certain regions have dot deployment or player place terrain. Is that something you enjoy?
No, I don't. I prefer the terrain to be set by the TO. I think the Kings of War game, we have enough to think about that I'd rather not have to worry about terrain.
that's a great segue into command dice, right? Because, they're a new thing that's come to the game, and that's a new element that you do have to think about. But, I'm looking at your army, Green Lady, you've got you don't play a lot of shambling units, I don't think. So that by the Master's will, the one that gets rid of shambling is probably not that big a deal.
That's nothing.
But I can imagine the Regen 5+.
So my 3 redemption units, Green Lady, the Flying Hero, they all have it. So, that only really is good for the Forsaken Knights, for the Flying Cavalry. They're the only ones that don't have it. So I do use it sometimes on them. But, I didn't have it before command dice came along, and I don't think command dice are affecting the game yet. I feel like command dice are adding a lot of time, effort, thinking, and I don't think it's worth it.
Because you're an Alpha Strike player, have you tried Vigilance? The one where you flubbed your Alpha Strike and you can re-roll it.
No, never have. Because you gotta declare it before you roll dice.
Correct. And it's 6 command points.
Well, first of all, I don't spend a point on buying extra command points. So it'd be a miracle when I get 6. So I probably end up with an average of 4. So I'm not gonna do that. But when I'm going in with my army, I'm going in with 3-4 units all at once. So how am I gonna pick which one? Just in case it fluffs. So I think it's just not worth. The return is just not worth the effort and the time and the thinking.
Let's talk scenarios. When you're building your list, are you consciously trying to ensure that your army can play, objective-based scenarios, movement-based loot? Are you thinking through all those things and saying, how am I going to play with this army in these, or God forbid you go to Texas and play one of those crazy Texas scenarios? Are you thinking through those things?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I like playing an all-comers list. So I want to build a list that's going to be able to play all scenarios, and that's going to be able to play against any army, any opponent faction. So, being Green Lady, capturing board is easier than picking up tokens. But I've built elements in the leads like regiments of infantry that allow me to pick up tokens and allow me to do things that still play to the strengths of my army. So I very much think of how am I going to play all these different scenarios and what is each unit going to do different based on the scenario. When
you're going to an event, does the scoring system being used affect your list building?
Not at all. Not at all. I really don't care what I'm going to face. I'm thinking, how is my army going to play the different scenarios? And do I have a list where I won't be concerned about what type of army I'm facing? I don't care at all about the scoring.
So things like attrition and stuff, that's all secondary. You're going to win the scenario, and the attrition is what the attrition is.
Yes, and having Alpha Strike, normally the attrition is decently high anyway.
Does playing out a clock affect your list? I mean, are you ever concerned that I'm taking too many units? It's going to take too long. It's going to take too long for me to play this army, or?
I tend to stick with an army and play it for 2-3 years. So I find that the clock, after the first 6 months is no longer a concern. But because I've eliminated shooting pretty much, I've only, I have very little. I have 4 shots in my army. So, and I only got healing as magic. So I find that I've eliminated so much of some of the phases that the clock is not a concern anymore. And I've played it for a year and a half. So,
yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? If you know the army, even if it's got a lot of units and plays in a lot of phases and does a lot of things, it's like Jeff O'Neill, right?
Yes.
He plays like 1 million goblins and he shoots the crap out of you. Like some players would have a hard time playing that army because you have to know very quickly target selection, priority, and you got to get through that stuff. But as you said, repetition, you learn, and it becomes it's muscle memory at that point. So when you're building your list, are you considering that first turn roll or the turn 7 roll, or does that impact you at all?
No, because I think it will be what it will be. I just want to make sure that when I deploy in a way that if I don't go first, my chaff is not going to be shot off. So you always play thinking that you're not going to get what you want. And then when you do get what you want, it's a plus.
Yeah. There's several people that have said, I just plan to get the second turn. Right. And if I have the, I'm planning to not get to decide. Right. And if I do, well, that's just an extra decision I get to make. Yeah. We have this annual Clash of Kings that comes out every, fall, early winter. How does that impact your list building? I mean, when it comes out, are you taking it and dissecting it and figuring out the efficiency and running it through your brain to figure out how am I going to update my list to be even more lethal?
Oh, yes. Well, definitely. Sometimes it's less lethal, right? Like the last change to Green Lady, when unicorns stay the same points but lost all their spells. Meant that I've never seen anybody else use unicorns ever again since that change. So then what's going to be chaff now if I don't have my unicorns? So those annual refreshers keep the game exciting, are a fun, good thing. And it's fun getting those changes and working out what's going to be different and how you can optimize it and how you can change it. So, I think a fun part of the hobby is doing many lists. We're probably all guilty of doing 10 lists for every game we play. We just go and do different lists and try different tweaks and different units. And that's part of the fun, and it helps, having a refresher every year.
It's interesting. I'd love to hear your take. Obviously, you're a long-term Warhammer player. In Warhammer, it was more of a list-building game in the sense that I could show up to the table. I'm playing against Dark Elves. Maybe I have Chaos. I already know how the dance is going to go. I know what spells you're going to cast. It feels like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like it's less in Kings of War, and it's more about the player agency over their army. Do you get that sense, or am I wrong? Is it's still a list building game at its core?
So I play the old world too. I play both, and the old world is not as balanced as Kings of War. So Kings of War is a more balanced game. Okay, still a dice game, but I think balanced is good. So there is still some element of that in the old world where, okay, I play Bretonnians, and right now Bretonnians happen to be a very strong army compared to most of the others. But I know that if I go against Tomb Kings, I'm going to struggle. Right? So there is that element. It is better than it used to be, but it's still nowhere near as good as Kings of War in terms of the balance and the smoothness of the game.
That's a good point you're making, though, Marcelo, that the balance of the armies internally and within armies affects the viability of various builds. Because, I think balance in Kings of War means there are probably multiple ways for most of these armies to play, right? It doesn't have to always be once, they're probably more efficient builds, but it doesn't mean you have to always. Yeah. I mean, in fact, you came up, we were playing a game this past weekend in Arkansas, and the gentleman was playing Green Lady, and he had no Forsaken Knights. And I was like, I have never seen a Green Lady army with no Forsaken Knights. But he was a hobby guy. He's like, this is what I wanted to play. I wanted to play infantry and some cool knights. Yeah. And I was like, cool. I think Kings of War is a game that can lean you into that. But on that note, in terms of hobby, does the hobby sometimes take precedent over the lethal efficiency of the unit? Like, do you ever see a unit and go, in your head, you've got this great backstory, and you know that it's probably not the most efficient selection, but it's got to make the list because it's a cool theme. It's a cool, evocative story. I mean, does hobby ever trump your list building?
It does, but it doesn't last for long. So, running a club called Battle Pilgrims, when I was playing Brothermark, we have, I can't even remember the name of the unit now, but we have like a trashy infantry unit for which I was using the Battle Pilgrims to, the old Games Workshop Battle Pilgrims, to represent a very trashy infantry that, Brothermark has. And I was doing hordes of them and legions of them. And just because I loved how they look and I loved their trashy look, running along the knights and idolizing the knights. So I played it for quite a while, but then I decided I wanted to win games. And going into tournaments, I couldn't really be running those kinds of leagues, so I retired them. So I go into these phases where that happens, and then I revert back to, well, I enjoy winning too, so I'm going to go back to my effective units.
So are your pendants sitting on the shelf then?
They are. I have hundreds and hundreds of them.
So when you're building a list, how does the number of points that you guys are playing affect the list?
I prefer 2,300. That's like my ideal Kings of War size. When it drops to 2,000, I just don't enjoy it as much. Like, there is Dead of Winter that I'm going to in New York at the end of the month. Great TO, great event, but it's 2,150. And I'm still going to go and have a good time because it's great people and it's going to be fun, but I just don't enjoy the 2,150 games as much as I enjoy the 2,300 point games. So I prefer that. I also don't enjoy 2,700 points or like things that are too big. So I find that we struck a balance in the US. I know Australia is more 2,000 points. I think we did really well in the US at 2,300 level. I think is ideal for Kings of War. It's my preferred size.
Yeah. What's interesting is we did used to play 2,000, 1995, and then maybe the second or third, one of the earlier Masters, we just collectively made the jump to 2,300. And I think ultimately what you're hitting on here is that I think we found that 2,300, at 2,300 points, every army can find a build. But when you're playing 2,000, there are some armies that just struggle at 2,000 points because maybe they are a very elite army and their units are more expensive and they can't get all the tools they need. And maybe some armies like elves could have more of an advantage at 2,000 points. And then when you go the other direction, 2,700, great for narrative play, but terrible if you're a TO and you're trying to get, you're trying to get Dustin Howard to finish the game on time.
That's not easy to do.
No.
Dustin likes taking his time.
So when you look at list building and what makes it successful, what's the most overlooked thing by players?
I think it's making sure they know what the job of every unit is and actually carrying it out into practice on the game. Because I find many players might sometimes, when they're doing in the list, think, okay, I'm going to use these units for this and the units for that. But then they get into the game and they get excited or they're under pressure. And then those units don't end up doing the job that they thought about. So having both those things in mind and actually carrying out the plan that you had in mind to begin with is what I think a lot of players just have struggled with.
Yeah, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Mike Tyson, right? And it's like once you're in the grind, it's funny. I sometimes feel like just my adrenaline's pumping and I start to make bad choices. And maybe I had a plan and I am slowly deviating away from it. So it's a good reminder to, go in with a plan and stick with it, right? Stick with it as long as you possibly can. What's the most important question that a new player should be asking themselves during list building?
I think for a new player, they should be looking at what kind of style do they want to play. Like get a feel for what do you like to do? Do you like to wait for somebody to come to you and react? Do you like to stay at range? Do you prefer a close combat grind? Is that think of the style, think of the type of game that you think you would enjoy, and then try to put a list together that plays into those elements of the game that you think you'll enjoy. Don't worry about how effective it is. When you're a new player, you just need to make sure you enjoy the game, and then you learn as you go along.
Yeah, if it's fun, you'll stick with it.
Yeah.
So how has your list building process evolved since you started?
I was very much into Hammer and Anvil originally. and making the envol stick and be strong, and then be more of a counterpunch army, so that my fast elements were counterpunching. So, I hit ballistas, I hit some lightning bolt, I hit things that would make the opponent come to me, and my cavalry units were more of a reactive force once they came. And over time, I felt, well, that's really giving the agency of the movement to my opponent, letting them decide when they come in, right, and where. So I changed my game to, I want to control the movement, and I want to decide where the units go and where. And that's when I moved away from the hammer and envol and thought, okay, I need more hammers and chaff pieces so that I can determine what goes where and where the fights are held. And that, I would call it that the list went from hammer and envol to hammer and chaff. And if you can win the chaff game with an Alpha Strike army, you can then win the game.
Well, we've kind of got through all the general principles of list building, and now we're at that part of the show where we're going to have you select one of your best, most awesomest lists. Give us the background on the list. Where was, where did the list idea originate from? And then, what drew you to this army specifically?
So I was playing Brother Mark before this list that I did for the Green Lady. And that was very much a hammer and envol list. And Jeff Trash came to the US to play in our events in March a couple of years ago, March 23. And when he came over, he said, Marcelo, let me show you why you should leave Brother Mark and play Green Lady. And he put an initial list together, which is not the list I have today. Jeff writes very different kinds of lists, but I got the concept of, you're waiting for people to come to you with a hammer and envol with some light shooting, while this is how you can control the game and go to them and decide where you fight. And that kind of put a lightning bolt on my head. And I've done many iterations of list scenes, and I've changed it to suit my style. But I enjoyed, number one, that it still does, good nights, and the theme is pretty similar. It's pretty much along the same lines, while having more ownership of how the game turns out by being more proactive in how the units move and what the units do, and putting a list together that does that. So a lot of my iterations are going to be about, okay, how are my best hammers? How do I optimize the hammers? And then how do I optimize chaffs? And how can I get more chaff? Because there's never enough chaff. You always want more chaff. You can always do with another one chaff. How can I squeeze another chaff? And then we have to win games. So what am I going to do to capture table quarters, carry tokens that my flyers don't want to carry, put unit strength on the table? So those are the three elements that I'm looking for. So the list that I'm using currently for Green Lady starts with 2 men-at-arms regiments. And these are, the quiet stars of most games. They're the units that most people ignore because they're not going to punch you in the face. The knights look a lot more scary. And if they can shoot or anything, they're going to try and take off a chaff that they know it's going to hold them up. And these regiments of men-at-arms, their goal is to camp out. They don't want to fight. They're lovers. They're not fighters. They just want to stay away from the fighting, but they want to end up on a nice juicy token. They want to carry some tokens. And I try to put him in places where the fighting is the least, or there is no fighting. When you have opponents that castle up in a corner, okay, my men-at-arms are going to go and capture objectives on the other side. I have, as my hammers, I have 3 orders of redemption, which are 20 attack knights with crash 1. They inspire, and it's what I like about redemption knights is that they don't just punch hard; they can also grind with having crash 1 makes a big difference to just having thunder 2. Having thunder 1 crash 1 is
You're hitting on something really important, though, with cavalry. The best cavalry is Thunder 1, Crush 1, right? Like,
yes,
that extra crushing 1 makes all the difference in the counterplay, right?
Because a Thunder cavalry can grind. And if you don't take them down when you go in, they can grind. So, and I haven't fully kitted out. I have Brew of Sharpness on 1. I have Elite Blessing of the Gods on another. And I have Brew of Strength on the 3rd. So they're really kitted out to go in and try to delete. But if you really want to delete, defense 5 or 6 or, 15, 17 or higher nerve, you always need to think that you need to double charge. Like even no matter how good your hammer, you can never rely on one unit taking down an opponent's 15, 17 defense 5 or higher. So, I have those 3 units. I have 2 Forsaken, the Flyers, 1 with Helm of the Drunken Realm for the extra thunder, and 1 with Jesse's Boots for that 1-turn striding Pathfinder. And I find that sometimes I'm using Jesse's Boots not to charge into terrain, but to actually give me a 20 each movement that allows me to land in terrain and end up on an opponent's flank. So what you're doing is you're placing units at a slight angle on one big far flank with the thinking that you want to end up by turn 2 on the opponent's flank. Okay? And Jesse's Boots allows you to do that. And it catches most people by surprise. Most people don't realize that you can use it in the movement, not just when you're charging. I have 3 Pegasus. Why do I have 3 Pegasus? Because I can't have 5 Pegasus. If I could have more Pegasus, I will have more Pegasus. So they are great chaff because they're height 4. So even if they go in and don't do any wounds, they're still height 4 and they block line of sight. So they still hold up opponent units. I have a Naiad Stalker. So this is a little hero that has like 4 shots, 4 attacks, crash 1, piercing 1. And he's really just another chaff. Because he's got ensnare, if you can put him on terrain somewhere in the center of the board where he can just annoy people and maybe take down some chaff with these few little shots, when he gets charged in, with ensnare, in terrain, and I've also got the non-glass shield on him, he's going to be defense 6. He's going to hold something up, He's the guy is sending, so he's my 4th chaff. The Green Lady, which I love, just doing, the healing when you need to, but most of the time you're doing Cloak of Darkness and putting, through the course of the game, 20 wounds or more on enemy units. As you land behind them or in front of them between your units when they charge in and start taking wounds out of them, it adds up, and her healing helps, obviously. And the last model, number 13 drop, is an Exemplar Redeemer. So the Winged Unicorn, the Flying Hero. And the way that I think about this list is I'm going to put 2 redemptions in the center or close to the center, 1 able to support each of the flanks. I'm going to be putting on each flank Forsaken. 1 is going to have the Redeemer for inspiring next to it. And the other one is going to have the 3rd redemption. So it's also inspired. So that way the whole army is inspired. Those Pegasus need to stay, they can't go on the far flanks. They need to stay kind of 1/3 of the board each, 1/4 to 1/3 from each flank. So that they're kind of outside the units, in the center of the units, as pegs are kind of 1 in the middle and 1 between each center unit and flank units, because a peg's job is to go and front charge something to hold them up while the hammers take other units down. And the green lady often starts in the center, so that way she flies 20 and she can still do her cloak of death. So she can easily go and support whatever flank that needs it once that's decided.
And we said this was a 2,300 point list. How much unit strength is in this list?
25. 13 drops.
Is there anything that you have found play against that's difficult? Is there any armies that you have struggled with? Or like you mentioned it before, you are a fan of combined arms, and does it do well against everybody?
It does. When I've lost games, and I win more than 90, I would say 90 to 95% of my games. When I lose games, it tends to be not because of the list, but because I did not play it well enough. So when I think of the game at Masters against Ed Fisk, where I should have surrounded them and put units on both flanks, and I only did it on one flank, so that there was nothing wrong with the list. That was me not playing the list properly. So there is nothing that I'm worried about facing.
It's about the player, not the list. Like at the end of the day, Kings of War games are won with a good general.
Well, having a good list does help, but you need to know how to pilot it.
In terms of scenarios, is there any scenarios that, maybe it does really well on, and there's scenarios that maybe it's not as good?
I like people concentrating in the center of the board so that I can flank them from both sides. So I love dominate. I love something that's going to put everybody, like most of the opponent's army, in the center of the table.
It's like, move here so I can punch you.
Yeah. So that I can get around both flanks and face you from the front. So that's what I hope for, especially against the dwarves. Like I love dominate against the dwarves because yes, it's a lot of defense 6, but when you flank things, it doesn't matter. The ones that it struggles with the most is when you have to pick up tokens, because really I only have 2 regiments of infantry that, try and go and pick up tokens. And the moment I start trying to pick up tokens with chaff or hammers, then that reduces the effectiveness of the army. But I find that I tend to not to get bogged down with those tokens. I tend to come back for them later. So the infantry regiments will pick up the most tokens they can. And then the others will just be left on the table. And then when I've dealt with the opponent's army, I come back to those tokens.
One thing we didn't really talk about was progressive scenarios, which are now part of Clash of Kings.
Mm-hmm.
Have you tried the progressive scenarios, and how have you found your army?
Yes, I have. I have tried them. I play a lot of firefight as well, so I love progressive scenarios. And I love the command dice in that game, which is, it's a great mechanic for that game. Progressive scenarios here is, I feel that having a fast army helps with progressive scenarios. The fact that you can be where you want to be, where you need to be very quickly. I feel that this list plays progressive scenarios very well, even though most progressive scenarios might not start scoring until turn 2 or 3 to give every army the opportunity to get there. Dictating where the units are going to be better than your opponent gives you an advantage in progressive scenarios.
Tell the audience why they should play Order of the Green Lady.
Because it has all the tools that you'll need. So when you think of the challenges, when you think of the questions that your opponents are going to be posing, how are you going to deal with my defense 6? How are you going to deal with my heavy shooting? How are you going to deal with my alpha strike? How are you going to deal with my hammer and nimble cannon punching army? Is that the Order of Green Lady has answers to all those things. So, it has crashing, and you can add more crashing, more thunder with magic items. It has speed to deal with the shooting. Sure, you get shot, but, you're on top of them by turn 2. It has speed to be able to take down a flank and still race to the other side of the table and be playing on the other side. And cover the whole board. So it has all the tools that you need to be able to face any kind of questions that your opponent gives you.
Would you say this army is new player friendly?
I think that it's kind of medial level. I think if a new player came to me, I would send them to something that's more hammer and anvil. And that's where I think new players need to start. So I wouldn't call it new player friendly. It's also not the hardest. Like, there is many other armies that takes a higher level of skill to play. When I think Night Stalkers, when I think, there's a bunch of other armies that have more combinations that are needed. So I would put this middle of the road in terms of difficulty to play. But I wouldn't put a new player on this. I would put him on a hammer and anvil type army.
I wonder, this is a concept we've chatted about a few times, but Alpha Strike armies are aggressive, but they're also the most important armies for you to be patient.
Oh, yes.
You have to hold until it's the right time. So maybe talk through that, because for me, I have no patience. So that's why I can't play Alpha Strike, because I just throw everything to the wind and then I get destroyed. So maybe talk about the role that patience and springing your trap plays in an Alpha Strike army, like what you're playing here with the Green Lady.
Yes, that's a big thing, because when you play Alpha Strike, the natural thing to do is just to rush in. And we are facing those counterpunch armies. If you don't set up your chaff right, if you don't give yourself time, then you just get destroyed back. And in my progression, when I think what was the most key element of me getting better, winning tournaments, ending up first in the Mid-Atlantic, and what made that difference is the patience, is knowing that you don't have to charge to win a game, knowing that if the tokens are in the center of the table, or you're playing invade, or keeping that mission in mind, so that if you can threaten and scare your opponent to stay on the table, on their side of the table, and retreating in their deployment zones, which is what they often do, and you can win the game by just not charging, then don't charge. But that's it took me years of practice to develop that patience to do that. I have that now, but it wasn't easy to get.
I would also imagine that a Green Lady list, from a hobby perspective, lots of really cool things you could do, right? Because you're mixing elements of, Arthurian Green Knights and Peg Knights and different kinds of, feral beast or, elementals. So it's a pretty ripe theme that you could really, lots of cool models out there.
And I mean, if you like knights, the ideal is to have every knight, every model in a different color scheme, with all the house colors. So again, I wouldn't call that beginner friendly, because if you're thinking of painting every model in a different color scheme with a different coat of arms and doing the kinds of elements you mentioned of nature as well, I think this might be your second or third army rather than your first.
We're going to go into the question section where we hit you with 10 rapid fire questions. Are you ready for this?
Okay, I'll do my best.
What's your favorite army?
Green Lady.
What is your least favorite scenario?
Loot.
What drives you creatively or competitively?
Competitively.
When your opponent rolls snake eyes?
I feel sorry for them.
When you roll snake eyes? What is your favorite hobby material?
Plastic.
What is your biggest gaming pet peeve?
People not marking their units before they move them.
If you had to replace miniature wargaming with another hobby, what would it be?
A board game instead of miniature games.
What other miniature war game would you not want to play?
I'm a miniature wargame addict, so I can't think of a game I would not want to play.
If you had a romantic evening with Ronnie Renton, what would you whisper sweetly to him?
Thank you for trying Command Dice, Ronnie, but I think they should go back to Firefight, where they work well.
Well, thanks, Marcelo. I really appreciate you coming on and dumping out the contents of your brain in terms of how the general principles that you go through to build a list, and obviously showing that in action with the list that you shared. And is that the list you've been playing recently?
Pretty much. I made some little tweaks in items.
Was that the one that went to Masters, or was that a little bit different version?
No, it was a little bit different to the one that went to Masters, but not by a lot.
So as you're listening to this, if you're interested to see the list, it will be included in the show notes for your download. So Marcelo, I really appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me, Rob. It was a lot of fun.
Well, don't forget, no matter how dire things are, you can always countercharge.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Countercharge. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at counterchargepodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter at countercharge15, or by commenting on the Countercharge Kings of War podcast Facebook group. If you enjoy the show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Until next time, keep countercharging. Music is a composition of Kevin MacLeod and is licensed under Creative Commons.